Hello, listener, an exciting podcast because we had the opportunity to play FIFA 23 and can now talk about it. It was an early build, but there is a lot to discuss because it's fair to say there have been quite a few changes, and we'll be talking about the Gameplay Deep Dive too. Looking forward to getting into it, and I can introduce, as I so often do, FUT legend AirJapes. How are you enjoying maybe a slightly less FIFA-filled summer?
It's good. I am still surprisingly maybe playing more FIFA than I anticipated, which is kind of fun.
Yeah.
I've enjoyed some of the content this summer. I think there have been some fun cards and stuff, but I think the exciting times are all ahead for us.
Yeah, there is a lot that's come out over the past week or so, I should say, and it's a little bit of a tricky time for me, actually. I'm currently moving out of the place I've been for a few years. So bear in mind, things are going to probably be released at a strange time. Not quite sure when this will come out, but thanks for bearing with that. And do send any questions, comments in. Very keen to cover them on future podcasts. Also keen to introduce our next guest, NealGuides. Hello.
Hello, thank you for having me back on again.
Great to have you. And exciting because you actually played FIFA 23 out in Vancouver at EA HQ.
That is correct. I did go to Vancouver. I did get an early glimpse of FIFA 23. So I'm looking very much forward to times ahead, as Japes was saying. I think especially towards the beta, I believe that's coming. If you do get the invite, if you're lucky enough to get the game code, I believe it's in 2 weeks' time, or normally around about that time every year.
Yeah, that'll be interesting. And we can introduce our final guest, who is top 2 NA player on the podcast. 𝘬𝘗𝘬𝘦, welcome back.
Thank you for having me. I have not played the new build of FIFA yet. I guess my 400 something followers was not quite enough to get me an invite, but looking forward to hearing more from you guys about it and asking some questions.
And I guess it's quite good because we're in a situation where, Japes, you've not had much time to have a look at the pitch notes at all. They've only very recently come out, and you also didn't get much of a chance to play the build. So, yeah, Japes, is there anything particularly interests you, either in what you've kind of seen glimpses of, or the thing that you were thinking, I hope this changes for FIFA 23?
I don't know about hope it changes, but Ben, once upon a time, I was a huge fan of semi-assisted shooting, and there might be a reason to be that again.
Indeed, yeah. An improved semi-assisted shooting, which actually will give you, I think it said something like a 50% improvement, or a doubling actually, of your accuracy when taking on a shot with semi-assisted. Neil, is this something you had an experiment with when you got hands-on with the game?
Yes, it's actually a very interesting feature. I think one of the things that really frustrated me this year in 22 was finishing. And I think I used to use manual back in the day. I used to play full manual controls, but I eventually moved to assisted after I realized all my friends weren't using manual and I was just losing all the time. Well, not losing, but playing a different game, I would say. But the semi-assisted shooting is actually a very, very interesting feature because now you can have the accuracy, of course, is that penalty. If you do miss, you could probably hit the shot outside the post most of the time. But I think the benefit of just increasing accuracy, trying to get the ball into the corner will make a big difference, I think, for the skill gap.
Yeah, it feels like they're looking to go more manual, as they have done the past few years. Do you think that's something that's fair to say based on what we've seen, Hugh? And is it something you're looking forward to? I guess it's a more competitive play, you probably are.
Yeah, I'm certainly all for it. Anything that kind of improves the ability of more skilled players and also hopefully decreases the need a bit for like top cards in the game. If it's more reliant on what your ability is with the controller, then that's certainly a good thing for me. I think we've talked in the past about like pro tournaments where maybe if everyone had the same access to the same players and then it just came down to your skill with the controller, that would be a better sense of who the best players are. So it sounds like they're kind of taking a step in that direction as well.
Yeah, on top of that, you got the fact that it looks like lobbed or over-the-top through balls are going to have a separate controller option, it says, and they're going to be locked under competitive controls, so input to semi-assisted. And that does make sense because this cycle, ground through balls, while effective, have not felt nearly as overpowered being semi-assisted as over-the-top through balls, which seems to have been assisted this cycle, which kind of makes sense, Neil, as to why they were pretty strong.
To be honest, I always found them to be very overpowered, especially, when the meta was very much get the ball, kind of face away 45 and then do the L1 triangle over the top. I found it was maybe a bit too overpowered, but I think if semi-assisted is a default, it's kind of putting more onus on the individual now to actually aim it. So I think hopefully we'll get a bit more of the skill gap, so those that are probably still be quite easy to do, but I think at least you're going to intend to do it, not by just hitting and hoping, as you said, by aiming one direction, doing a complete power, or using the L1, doing a driven variation of it, the threaded.
The flip side of that, and what always like concerns me with this, is that it makes it so that any player can hit these insane through balls.
Yeah, as in any
right? Like
foot player, as in on the pitch.
Yeah, whatever you want to call it, like character in the game. Or,
yeah.
You know, like you can all of a sudden hit this like magical pass, and you know, I think that's the hard part with these semi-assisted controls, because you want it to be that way in many senses, because then it's more controlled by the user. But in the same token, like
if it's like a doubling of accuracy, someone who's not very good at passing is then going to be very good at passing. So
totally, I think back to once upon a time in FIFA, you had a competitive mode where it made every player 86 rated overall, and that is then it's like even across the board. And my question is, with like the semi stuff, is it going to basically level out all the stats? So pace just reigns king again.
Yeah.
Right? Or like physical attributes reign king. So I don't know.
Yeah, that brings us on to one of the most manual things in the game, I guess, in FIFA 23, alongside what we have currently, which is heading. This new power shot is going to be manual controlled, and that is LB and RB. It means you get this big wind up, big run up to the shot, and then they'll hit it with what is, I guess, increased likelihood to beat the keeper. But it's going to take quite a bit of getting used to. Let's just say that it wasn't just 𝘰𝘳 top tier that was under threat, but on a few occasions, actually, the linesman, which I wasn't expecting.
So just like Ben in real life.
Well, yeah, one of the most realistic things I've seen. But the thing is, it's not just the fact that when you're aiming it initially, you have to keep that aim throughout the motion, and it's quite a long motion. I was moving the analog stick towards the end, so that's what the shot would take into account. And so that's probably an important thing to think about. That big wind up is also something you have to get used to for sure. I was thinking, Neil, if people want to practice this, they could switch to manual shooting and then take some long shots or even closer range shots, and they'll start to get used to that feel of manual shooting, which I think people won't find intuitive. I don't know, perhaps you picked it up quite quickly.
That was basically the same as you. I'm sure people.
That's good to know. It's not just me.
That's aiming for the crowd, but once you get used to it, I think it would be a good feature. I think, one issue we had this year was with drop back. I think if the balance is right, like in 1v1s when I did use it, it was very, very effective if you have loads of space around you. But as you said, the animation does take quite a long time to load up. So someone can see it coming. The kind of way I looked at it is, do you remember like the setup touch? I think they brought that in FIFA 20, I believe. Is it FIFA 20?
Yeah, 20 or 21.
But like a more powerful version. But I can't remember anyone even using a setup touch, to be honest. But this one was obviously visibly much more effective. And as you said, for me in 1v1s, I found it to be effective and also outside the box. But it'll be interesting. I wonder if you can, as you said, practice on manual. I wonder if it's kind of like the same aiming mechanics. That actually might be a good way to kind of give yourself a bit of a practice, a bit of a gist on how roughly the controls will work when 23 does come out.
Hugh, how do you feel about this kind of shot? I guess it's good if you're trying to break down a pack defense, right?
Yeah, I'm actually a big fan of it just because I think it's like a high risk, high reward type thing. Whereas in this FIFA and also, of course, previous FIFAs, it felt like if you're outside the box, there's a few key spots where you can score from, and unless you're in those spots, will never shoot. So like if you're at like the corner of the box or just outside, dead on, you think, okay, a finesse from here probably has a decent chance of going in. But say you're kind of like at a 30-degree angle and it's not like that ideal meta spot to shoot. Like no one ever shoots, and it makes the game like very predictable. So even if it's not a high chance of scoring, it still gives you something to think about. You have to close people down. Maybe you do one of those setup touches Neil was talking about, and then you fake shot and someone slides and go around them, or you win a free kick. So like it's just another way to like make the game interesting and less predictable. So for me, I'm all for it, even if it's not going to be like something I'm doing like every time I get the ball in the opposition half.
Yeah, one thing, I don't know whether you noticed this, Neil, but it is cancelable. So you can really bait people
Ben,
out.
don't reveal the secrets now. Oh,
well,
no.
I feel like they might remove it, or maybe there's a setting in there that I missed, because it feels like, well, the AI does it, and that was annoying enough sometimes. You're focusing, and then suddenly it does this zoom effect, which you get distracted by. And I think it could be used to grief people. People will do that if they can, and you can do it lots of times in a row and really annoy people. So whether they make it so that your opponents don't show up, perhaps, or there's a setting to change it, either way, unfortunately, I think it does need to be cancelable, and it's probably a good thing. People wouldn't use it if they couldn't cancel it, because it is such a lengthy animation. Not being able to get out of that just feels a bit silly and would feel quite natural, actually.
I think there is a feature where I think you can turn it off on your side. So if you do it, because I found it very irritating.
Yeah.
Because it restricted I use co-op camera angle. I like to see if I lose the ball and I'm midway through the animation, where my players are for the counter attack. So who can I switch to next? The radar. And when you zoom in, you kind of lose that field of view. So I think there might be a way to turn it off in the settings. I'm not 100% sure though.
Did you guys try green timing any of those power shots? I'm curious how much that helps if it's like a manual thing.
It does help. You can green time them, but I didn't try it enough. Like, it would be hard for me to say. It's a really good shot anyway, so I guess it would be useful, especially if you're using a player with lower long shots, I guess, maybe.
Feels like with a longer run-up, it would be somewhat easier to time, almost like a penalty right now, where you know kind of how long it's going to take to get to the ball, so if you practice it enough, you can get pretty consistent with it, whereas if you're someone who tries to green time shots like in the box at an angle, it's hard to predict how long that animation will take.
Yeah. I think that's a good point, actually. It probably will be a bit easier. Also, the other thing about it is that it actually, I found, was pretty effective when taking on volleys. I think people don't put that much pressure on you on volleys and when the ball's in the air sometimes. And you can kind of start it a bit earlier than you'd think, like when the ball's being trapped. And that actually made scoring volleys or taking down the ball and then shooting feel more effective than it has before. And I think combined with the new next-gen animations, it feels quite nice. And scoring them is really satisfying, especially with that manual aim. I think it's a really nice addition in that sense. And I do like things like that. So for me, that was a big positive. Hopefully, it's not just one of those gimmicks that people try and then just stick to whatever they were doing the year before, because I think it could be something that makes a bit of a difference. Let's kind of open the floor a little bit more. Hugh, going through, is there anything that you were like, oh, that could be a good little addition, or maybe something that you've seen that they've tweaked that you like the look of?
Yeah, there's definitely a few things I noticed. I think the left-footed skill moves are certainly something that'll add some variety. I was curious if you guys knew if that's just something where like a left-footed player would do a left-footed elastico, or you can control if any player does it, because I'm curious, like if you reverse the elastico motion for a left-footed player, that's the same as the reverse elastico. So I don't know, like...
Yeah, so is left footer does a left-footed version of the skill move, and the elastico direction is essentially flipped to the other side.
I think that's awesome.
Yeah, it's quite nice. It's a nice detail, and I think it will catch people out, won't it?
It makes shapeshifter cards interesting when they do the foot change.
Yeah.
I wish there was a way that you could do it on both feet if you had like a 5-star weak footer, but you can't.
Yeah, I guess it would need some kind of input to
the
do it.
controller.
When was the last time you saw Neymar do an elastico with his left foot?
That was the last time we saw ball scoop.
Well, this is going to start the debate of like our skill moves for players that could do them versus do them.
Yeah. I think that is I guess it's become less relevant now. So many players end up getting 5-star skills, and people debate it less. But there was that thing of like, should every player have 5-star skills? Because ultimately, it's just the user who decides to do them.
I used to be the one that would say, I bet you John Terry could do Burba spin not a Burba spin, a McGeady spin if he wanted to, but he's certainly not doing it ever. But he could. He just wouldn't pull it off that fast. This is way back in the day.
Yeah,
but.
So basically you're saying Harry Maguire should be able to do a 𝗲𝗍𝗲 flip.
That's what I'm saying, Ben.
Well, at AirJapes on Twitter if you disagree. But let's talk a few skill moves. We got the stutter feint, which is a little shimmy skill, 3-star skills. I think it's all right. I mean, it's hard to tell, having only played the AI, how effective these are, so I'll rattle through them. The heel to ball roll, you can see 𝘵𝘂𝘃𝘁 doing this in the reveal trailer, and I think that's going to be an effective one. One to keep an eye on. It's basically a variant of the heel to heel with a little ball roll move beforehand. Quite nice. The heel fake is a nice little flair skill I think people will enjoy, but it's 5-star skills, whereas the heel to ball roll is 4. There's some new fake shots, which are probably going to be effective fake shots, especially new ones often are. But the thing that I was going to quickly ask you about is the fact that you can manually trigger outside the foot shots and passes with the L2/LT button, which I think is going to be a good additional way to give people more control.
Yeah, and especially for players that don't have good weak foot, that I think it would be pretty beneficial to be able to do that at times, and really just like kind of adds to the realism. Like if you're someone who knows the game well and has played a lot, and in game you think in this situation, if this player was playing this pass, they would do it in a certain way. And it just kind of gives you that more added level of control, which helps for immersion. Like I doubt it'll be like the meta thing to do is like spamming outside of the foot passes or shots, but like again, similar to the power shots and stuff, it's just like less predictable that if a player doesn't shift the ball to a certain side first, then you maybe don't know that he's going to play that pass. So it makes the game a little bit better.
Yeah, and again, more control, which I think, is nice. I think we should move on, and something I know, 𝗲𝗍𝗻, you may well be interested in is under attacking positioning, there's the addition of an instruction, which is deep lying playmaker instruction. We added a new player instruction for midfielders to consistently ask for the ball and gravitate towards ball handlers. I'm assuming by ball handlers, they're talking about players hanging onto the ball.
You know what they're talking about, Pat.
I mean, I don't know what you guys are calling that over there, but...
Well, basketball terminology
it's basketball terminology.
The player on the ball. They will come short to the player on the ball.
Makes sense. Later on, we hear in the pitch notes about ball shepherds as well, which sounds like a whole other thing. Not for this podcast, but anyway, this seems like quite a nice addition. I guess it's like free roam, but probably better and just for CDMs.
I tried free roam and it just didn't do what I wanted it to do, but this instruction sounds more like what I want. So if you have a midfield pairing of one player that's a real ball winner, and then you have your, Thiago Alcantara that is still like can do a job defensively, but you want him to start the attack every time. If that player is going to constantly check to the ball, check to your center backs, check to like other midfielders to receive the pass, like that's amazing. I'm all for this instruction.
Yeah, and I'll get on to something else in this attacking movement bit that you might find interesting. These aren't instructions as such, but things that might help. So one thing is double teammate support. Call more than one teammate close to support the ball. This can be requested by tapping R1/RB twice. That's on both versions of the game, and I think will help with people who feel overwhelmed by presses, bringing those two options closer. In terms of next-gen stuff, there's better offside awareness, more separation runs from markers if they have high attacking positioning, over 85+, and also updated tactical AI to prevent players from being stationary too long. But the big thing that I was thinking for you, 𝗲𝗍𝗻, could be nice is pin down defenders. Players with target man instruction or physically strong players, 85+ strength, will now try to back into defenders when inside the box. You can make use of this behavior to more effectively roll off of the defender after receiving the ball or perform a layoff. So, thoughts on that?
I'm into the idea of it. I think this is something that, when it comes to execution, is very much TBD. It could it could just kind of end up being broken towards the end of the game.
Yeah.
I know, and I'm also curious. They're talking about attackers that do this. Is it going to happen way too often? Right, that they end up trying to do it every single time, and you're like, maybe don't do it right now. I love the idea behind it, but I'm a little nervous, Ben.
Yeah, I wonder whether this might be something similar as well. Step-ins. Stronger players in control of the ball can now step into the defender's way and generate a bigger displacement when contacting weaker players. So you press and release LT/L2. So that's the shielding button to request that step in. There's also some shield pushback thing you can do now. So if you hold the left stick backwards towards your opponent, and when you're shielding the ball, you'll actually push the player away, which can be nice.
I mean, I think net for me is they're trying to do things to make players that aren't like typically meta more usable and give them tools to like better exploit their strengths, which are not generally strengths in a FIFA game. And I know I'm using strength. I don't mean necessarily physical strength, but the same thing with the player, the ball handler thing, right? Players that aren't necessarily like your 𝘃𝗲𝗃𝗀𝘁 might not necessarily be super pacey, but can ping a pass. And oftentimes doesn't get into good positions and is too slow to get into good positions, so he ends up entirely not usable. Giving these types of players that aren't traditionally meta tools in the game to actually maybe be able to use them. But everything's in execution.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, and I think something for the bigger player that I think Hugh will be interested in, having put out a crossing tutorial, is that extended crossing zone. I suppose you've seen this in the pitch notes, Hugh.
I have, yeah. It's interesting. It's similar to the power shots. It gives an extra option for unpredictability that typically from that zone it would just be like a lobbed pass, which is pretty ineffective from that type of space. So maybe if you're shifting the ball across and you cut inside and someone's open at the far post, it'd be a nice like little clipped cross into the back post. But again, yeah, I think it's definitely nice to, have more variety of things you can do from different parts of the pitch. Whereas right now it feels like if you're in this spot, you should shoot. If you're in this spot, you should pass. If you're in this spot, you should cross, and just like giving more variety to everything.
Yeah, I should say actually there's a full diagram in the pitch notes, but it's basically extending the crossing zone, which is out wide beyond the penalty box inside a triangle shape at the top of the penalty box on both sides. I was going to also mention on crossing, one of the things they're saying they're doing is making keepers much more consistent at claiming aerial balls. But Hugh, you were pointing out, it doesn't really feel like they've been weak this cycle. Actually, they've been very strong, especially if you move the keeper. I don't know whether, Neil, you noticed any difference in FIFA 23. I don't feel like I did.
So I never crossed the ball. Even from corners, I passed them.
Oh, really? Oh, I didn't know you're that.
Never. I don't score headers. In my opinion, as many will disagree, but I think it's very much RNG.
Japes is there like, what the?
I just don't like
So
the way it's...
I use the player lock for crossing all the time, Ben. That has become one of my absolute go-tos. I do something to create some space out wide, try to get a player free, and then manually switch with like a player lock, take the player that's on the far post and make a darting run to the near post, manually head it into the goal. Where's the RNG with that, Neil?
But you see, James, that's like the exception. Most of the time I see people just going down the wing, just smacking the ball in and hoping and praying. So I agree, there is probably a skill to it. But just for me personally, I never really crossed the ball. But if you think about the new shot, the one with the longer animation, and you think about extended cross zone, I think it might change the way defending will kind of be played. Maybe, okay, yes, goalkeepers might be effective, but maybe at that region, they made it in such a way where if someone is making the overlap or someone is coming late inside the box or using a player lock, it changes the dynamics of defending now. Because when you're outside the box, you can't just sit back anymore. And if you go forward, you then create more space. So I'm actually all for it. I mean, it's interesting to see how it transpires, of course, but
yeah.
If I'm thinking the way it is, it would be very interesting.
Yeah, it will be. And it's also interesting to see, obviously, in this last patch, there was this focus on more manual defending and reducing the impact of the AI defending. And I don't know whether that's something that I can say for sure is going to be a feature going into FIFA 23 because we only played against the AI, but it does feel like those reductions in the ability of the AI are there. So we'll have to see how that develops. One thing I did want to quickly go back to is the low-driven shot. People may have realized that L1 and R1 shot or LB and RB shot isn't a low-driven anymore. It's the power shot. How do we then take on a low-driven shot? Well, actually, they've made it a bit like they made heading in the last patch, where if you do a low-powered shot, so under 40%, I think it is, you then get a low-driven. But what I couldn't quite work out, Neil, be interested to know if you did a experimentation, if you did a 39% power shot, is that just going to be a very powerful along the ground shot compared to 10%, which is less powerful along the ground, or is it going to be like a higher shot?
Yeah, so from my understanding, I was kind of doing some testing as well with shooting. You can't think of it like a very light, almost like you're passing the shot into the goal. You can't really achieve that anymore. Because what happens is, if it's below 40%, it registers as low driven. Even if you're like a 1%, you're still going to have power. It's not like you can kind of like just pass the ball into the back of the net. So it's kind of interesting. I actually like it, to be honest, because is there really going to be a situation? Maybe sometimes. I was just thinking maybe in terms of accuracy, more like a passing. You're like a 𝘵𝘃𝗃𝘀𝘃 finish, cutting inside or going for the corner, like kind of pass the ball into the back of the net. But when I did it, I found that most of the shots that were very low power, they're just low drivens, but powerful.
Yeah, I think that's how I found it too. It's more that was setting the height of the shot rather than the power. And even if you did a very small amount of power, you were still getting a decent amount of power, if that makes sense. Let's move on to something else that I think you found quite interesting, you were saying, and that is the partial team press, which is someone who likes to press but doesn't want to leave myself exposed. I found quite good, actually.
It was a very interesting feature, which I was honestly very much looking forward to using, and I really like it. For those of you that do use Team Press, basically what it does is if you double tap and hold the Team Press button, so by default it should be R1 or RB if you're on Xbox, it sends basically two of your players to closely mark the opponent's passing option. So where I was trying it a lot was, for example, you know, in this FIFA where the meta is kind of like you pass the ball to the striker, you do a first time shot. With partial team press, you can somewhat mark the passing lanes. It's a very, very effective feature, and I really, really enjoyed using it because I like to press manually, and I think sometimes you want to cover a guy, but then you want AI to mark the passing lane, not to do it the other way around. Does that make sense? Whereas normally you have to kind of manually run back yourself and then use teammate contain and then switch that player when you're close by. So it was kind of a very interesting feature. I'm actually very much looking forward to using it, especially in FUT Champs.
This is something, Japes, I can see you giving a go as well, actually.
I mean, we live by the press, we die by the press. I think more so, I'm just, again, pro any tools that are going to give me additional ways of playing, I guess. And this certainly, I think, does that.
Yeah, I think it's also interesting, you know, it's another kind of high risk, high reward thing where if you don't get the ball, then you might have pulled two players out of position. So it could hurt you. It's certainly something that interests me. I'm curious, do you know is it the two players closest to the ball? Like if you had one player who was right next to the ball and the next one was, say, 20 yards away, is that other guy just going to take off running? Like, did you get a sense of, you know, how quickly that triggers? Is it similar to like the current like teammate contain right now? Like anything you can share on that?
It's the direction you're facing. It's a bit, from my understanding. So what I remember is, and I think someone was saying to me, it was that it's the direction that you're facing. And it's so let's say you're running back, if I'm not mistaken. I'm trying to think of an example when I use it. So I was running back and then I was using partial teammate contain. So it's the players that you're facing. Or I think, like, let's say, for example, you're the last defender. Or let's say there's a defender just before the last defender. If you use partial teammate contain there, the game is smart enough to understand, okay, that's the final man. And there's let's say the opponent is running in behind. So the game is smart enough to understand, okay, you're controlling a player that's way ahead. It will use partial teammate contain on that player as opposed to someone else. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that does make sense. Yeah, good to know, actually. One thing that may also interest you, Hugh, is I know one of your big frustrations with next gen is depth related, and I noticed there was a point about high depth teams holding the defensive line high, and they'll be quicker to push up the field when the opponent retreats. Also, just low depth teams will sit deeper and not push up. I mean, I don't know whether this actually is really going to help with your issue with the whole defense dropping back and that opening up space for your opponent, but it's certainly good to see some changes to depth. It was hard to know, I was just playing against the AI, whether there was still that exploitable defensive line, but I guess this is promising.
Yeah, it's certainly interesting to me. Hopefully, again, adds more variety. One issue I've found before is that the keepers start so far back. Even if you play a high line, they're starting like they stand basically on the goal line all the time. If you play a high line, there's so much room in behind for someone to play a through ball, and the keeper's so far away to come get it. I would like it if you play a higher depth, if the keeper naturally stayed closer to the edge of his box. Like in real life, Ederson is not standing on his own goal line, or Manuel Neuer isn't hanging out on his own goal line while the defensive line is at midfield. He's probably at the edge of the box, if not even further out, ready to come and sweep up passes in behind. So like even if you use the sweeper keeper instruction, it doesn't really feel like it. Like they'll come for the ball more often, but they don't start further out. So hopefully if we're able to hold a higher line, that the keepers kind of act accordingly, or else it feels like we're just kind of encouraging more through balls, which is like never really a good thing in FIFA.
Yeah, totally. It's going to be something that's interesting to see once playing against humans, certainly. One thing, Neil, I know you focus a lot on in guides you've done is the jockey, and that is something that's had a fair few changes as well.
Yeah, there is a big change to jockeying. Just want to say one thing though, this is only for new gen, so it's going to be interesting to see the difference between old gen and new gen. But one of the biggest things is, unless I've read this incorrectly, is that sprint speed no longer doesn't determine how fast a runner and jockey is. So defensive awareness stats going to be much more important this year, and I believe it determines the max speed while using the sprint jockey. So it's going to be interesting to see like certain midfielders who I would play in centre mid that were very good at cutting the passing lanes manually, that might be much slower with this. I kind of don't really like it. I think it does bring like that almost some of the lower tier players are not as effective anymore kind of thing. I hope it doesn't affect it too much, but it's something that I noticed. They don't really say the extent to how they do it, but that's one thing that I found. And of course, also defensive awareness does affect other things like the transition speed between a jockey and a sprint jockey, the acceleration, and also just generally just speaking, how they can move in certain angles. So I think that's a very interesting feature and a change to defending.
I think they also said that defensive awareness now impacts how fast they are to recover to where they're supposed to be. Like if you drag them out of position and then switch players, that higher defensive awareness players will now go back to their correct position quicker.
Right, let's move on to free kicks. Japes, do you remember the days of FIFA when to take a free kick, you used to move it was like a little reticule around the ball itself to get the trajectory and power and things like that?
Oh yeah.
Well, that's back.
The good old days.
The proper free kick system has returned, so you can now do that again.
Back when I was a free kick god.
Yeah, I mean, it was a way more satisfying system, certainly. Maybe a little bit more complex, potentially. I don't know whether you think it was, but it feels, and having tried it, a lot more satisfying. I enjoyed it. It was definitely going to take some getting used to. One of the things they've done is actually improved the practice arena free kick system and penalty system, so you can practice these things a bit better. But it's going to need some practice, and I think it's going to pay off to practice these things. I mean, I guess I've just explained it, but you just need to kind of choose where you're going to strike the ball, and then you direct it as well, and decide power. And I think it's going to be good. Neil, how did you find it?
So I actually looking very much forward to this because I think maybe every single time I just pass my free kicks all the time. I always find it much more effective. But I think it's going to be an interesting dynamic because now you can do the one underneath the wall properly. And of course, you can also have the defensive player lying down behind the wall. But I think it's an interesting aspect. As you said, I think the practice would be the real key here, I think. I'm actually looking forward to doing just different types of shots, to be honest. I know it just kind of sounds, but I just pass all my free kicks most time because it's not, for me, just not efficient to just shoot unless you really know the angle. But I think a top player, they put a player on the line or they move the goalkeeper a little bit. Sometimes unless you get that really green time shot, it's quite difficult to hit.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate that it's, again, kind of more realistic. Like in real life, you can't just be like, oh, I'm going to aim for the top corner and that's where it's going to go, like within some amount of error. Like you're having to decide where on the ball you want to hit it, and hopefully that's also impacted by like the run up and like exactly where it goes, like based on free kick accuracy and everything. So I definitely appreciate that. I'm curious to see if they do anything with longer range free kicks, like ones that you're not shooting, because it feels like so much of the time those are just not worth like playing long into the box. Like I don't think anyone ever does that. Like everyone just takes them short. So it'd be nice to see some sort of change to that, but I guess we'll see. But also seeing the change to penalties too. So I think it's good. It just keeps things a bit fresh, adds a new learning curve, something, change things up a bit.
Yeah, I agree. And actually, I was going to ask Neil how you found penalties, because I definitely need to practice some penalties going into FIFA 23. They were quite different, and the system, the way it works, is kind of like so different because you're not aiming it in a specific place. It's more about the power you're doing, and there's this composure kind of circle that you have to time in the right place. People are definitely going to want to practice this before they get caught out in penalties in an important game.
Well, now in theory, there's no reticle, and I think you can still hit it past the goal, but like I think you're more of the time it's fixated within the goal. But I think that composure circle is going to be interesting. I wonder if, for example, like let's say you're doing a proper penalty shot with 5 penalties each. I wonder how that circle would differ in speed depending, like if you have to get that penalty to score that goal, to stay in the penalty shootout, will that go at a different speed and stuff like that? That'll be very interesting as well. I know the composure stat does affect how that circle moves around the ball, and of course the closer it is to the ball, the smaller the reticle, the more accuracy you have or power, and of course the further away the less you have. But it'll be interesting to see how that changes, because I remember the good old days. Do you remember like when they used to have the reticle in penalties. I remember they used to be like, was it FIFA 16 in a very OP way where you could aim above the goalkeeper's head and he used to bounce off the crossbar and go in. I don't know if any of you guys remember that, but it would be very interesting. I've not actually tried it that much, but I think it's going to be one that's worth practicing. When I did use it though, I think I found it a bit easier, to be honest. Maybe that's just me, but I did find it a bit easier, personally speaking.
Yeah. And it also looks like, James, I don't know how you feel about this actually. The head, I think the head movement's gone. Do you think that's a good thing? Or?
Yeah, I think certainly it was maybe a little too broken, I would say. Like, I hate the head movement. It's like so obvious and goes against everything that feels normal in real life.
Do you think so? Or do you think, because obviously in real life, you can look at the goal, right? To bait the keeper. I mean, players do that, right?
Yeah, well, they do it to bait the keeper. I just have no control over which way I'm looking. Does that make sense? Like, I can't change it very easily, which I find annoying.
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit of a messy system in some ways currently, because you can look straight ahead and then change where you're putting the penalty, but you're going to be penalized for doing that, whereas that's pretty normal, I think. So yeah, this new system might be good. I think we've definitely got to see in action a bit more, especially, again, human versus human. Next, wanted to talk about one of, I guess, the final features, pretty much. One of the more significant things, the accelerate system that they're adding. And basically, the idea is that there's now going to be 3 archetypes of acceleration. You've got controlled, which is going to be the majority of players, explosive and lengthy. For explosive, you can imagine players like Vinny Jr. and 𝗵𝗡 fitting this mold. And for lengthy, it's going to be players like Van Dijk. They actually give the specific attributes that are required and heights to define whether these players are going to be explosive or are going to be lengthy, or whether they're, if they don't fit into those categories, they're going to be controlled. It sounds kind of good to have that variety in the way players move, because basically it's going to lead to a slightly different running or acceleration animation. But it feels weird to, in my opinion anyway, to have 3 distinct kind of categories when surely most players have some kind of mix of the 3 rather than being explosive, lengthy, controlled. It feels a bit binary to me, and the way that it's done is basically if you hit a certain threshold in terms of your height and stats, then you're one of these 3. I don't know, James, what do you think about this? Any particular thoughts? I guess it's maybe something you'd have to see in game.
Yeah, I think so. I'm pro players feeling a little bit more unique. I think the tricky part with players being more unique, obviously, is something I love to talk about, is like, how do they end up balanced as one body type or whatever become far superior? I think it's going to change big time the way the game feels.
Yeah, I think you made this point, Hugh, about if players do actually change within FUT, which is possible, different versions change because the stats are the things that matter here, that by the end of the cycle, like, no one's going to be explosive, right? You're noticing one of the particular requirements for their stats.
Yeah, it was something interesting. I think it says that, like, for the explosive type, that like agility minus strength needs to be greater than or equal to 15. And I was actually looking, so Gold 𝗵𝗡 has 92 agility, 77 strength, so that's exactly 15, so he would be explosive. But his first inform got +1 agility and +2 strength, so the difference is 14, so that inform 𝗵𝗡 would not be explosive, which I would hope that they could hard code these things to player body types as well, like, at least for the unique players, so like, no matter what, Vinicius or 𝗵𝗡 will always be the explosive body type, so you're not getting like a detriment from them having more strength, because that just like doesn't, like, they wouldn't be less explosive for a better card. But yeah, as you were saying, like, towards end of the game, everyone's pretty much 90 plus in everything. Worst case, maybe they're 99 agility and like 85 strength, which is still not explosive. So it'll be interesting to see that, like, if at the end of the game everyone's just kind of the same style with that, or maybe it doesn't really matter because they're all max pace, so it doesn't really change much, but it'll certainly be interesting.
Yeah, and it says acceleration type is calculated right before the kickoff. It's important to note that it is affected by attribute changes that can happen before the match, and it specifically says chemistry, which does kind of suggest, right, that if chemistry boosts a player into being explosive, for example, or what have you, that a different version of the player would also do that. So it's a strange thing because that could lead to it being almost irrelevant to foot, towards the end. Also, I think the final thing I wanted to say here, Neil, and it's probably something we could come back to, but I kind of struggle to really get into it and to really get to grips with it because I think it feels really quite different, and that's the whole dribbling system that they've added. This is technical dribbling, and they've laid out in quite a lot of detail what attributes make a difference, things like that. But it was quite noticeable how different dribbling feels in FIFA 23.
I think this will probably be the biggest thing that will probably split the community. I think it'll be a steep learning curve. For me personally, I don't know how everyone else left stick dribbles, but I flick my left analog stick as opposed to kind of holding it and rotating it. And I had a lot of difficulties dribbling. So it's going to be interesting to see how that kind of pans out and how they kind of work around that. And I think, especially given the fact that old gen and new gen are going to, I believe old gen doesn't have technical dribbling and new gen only does have it. It's going to make the gameplays completely different. So I think the biggest learning curve for everyone, I think, will definitely be the left stick dribbling. Because don't forget, this is independent from agile dribbling, not like skill. This is just purely just left stick movement. And I think that will be probably the biggest thing that's going to change. Maybe I think you'll hear a lot of negative things about it in the beginning, but I think with that, you just have to give it a chance, learn it first. And I think that will be the biggest hurdle, I suppose, the average player will have to, or every player they will have to go across.
Yeah.
Because it hasn't changed for like 20 years. I think I've been dribbling the same way since I was like a kid. So it's probably the most basic thing that we just overlook, should I say. But the biggest change.
Yeah, and I should say actually both L1 dribbling and R1 dribbling and the other types of dribbling, I suppose, in the game haven't changed, but the way that standard left stick dribbling works has kind of changed. I would say that at times I was finding it incredible. I felt it was really, really good. And I think it is what you're saying about if you can almost mimic a real player's movement in the way you move your left stick and kind of almost follow through in the motions you're doing with that left stick, I think it can work really well and you can get some really satisfying, natural looking moves. But it is that thing of, does it make players feel less responsive? Because at times the players did feel less responsive. And obviously that's always going to be something people don't like. It might feel more realistic. It might look more natural. And at times it was kind of breathtaking to see, but that isn't necessarily what people want. And I think that is something we have to see how it develops, because there's still plenty of time for tuning. And I'm kind of interested to see how it plays out. Anything at the end here, because we're going to be wrapping up pretty much now. 𝗲𝗍, you wanted to add?
No.
Good.
Facts, Ben. Facts.
I'll just say very quickly, just maybe be a bit more patient this year. I think because normally you see a bit of changes, but not that drastic. Whereas I think this year, defensively drastically changed, in my opinion. You can argue attack has, and things like lesser dribbling. So I think it's going to be a bigger hurdle than like most years where you can get quickly into it 1 or 2 weeks. I think it'll take a bit longer. So I'll just say, just be patient.
I think for me, that is the big thing. It was really enjoyable because it felt quite different. It felt good. It felt fresh. But then you think that is almost a negative too, because the jump between FIFA 21 and 22, I don't think was huge, and it made it easier to balance. Whereas I think there's more here for them to contend with in terms of balancing. So there might have to be a bit of patience in terms of that too. But either way, very much looking forward to playing it more. It was really interesting to play, and I'm really looking forward to playing against not just the AI, but other opponents. The other thing I wanted to say is quite a few questions in, which were really good ones. I want to talk about them more. We just haven't had time. And also, I know we're going to be talking about this again. Would welcome more questions via the usual channels at @FootWeeklyPod, footweekly@mail.com, all the usual places. I would really appreciate them. Just like I appreciate, 𝗲𝗍, having you on the podcast.
Cheers, Ben. Excited about, all the good things that are FIFA 23. A lot of changes this year, which is fun. Usually I feel like we're saying they're changing like a few things that feel like rather, I don't want to say like pointless, but...
Yeah, well, you did. But no, I see what you mean. There's normally a couple of things which are really big ticket items, then the others are, not that significant, but there's a lot that could have an impact here. We'll see. Anyway, thank you very much as well to 𝗍𝘐 for coming along. I guess you'll be chatting about it in the Discord. So anyone who's a gold or above supporter can head over there and continue the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. It's exciting. I think early access starts on September 27th. So that's exactly 2 months from today, which is pretty crazy.
With the Ultimate Edition, yeah.
Yeah, so it'll be exciting. And definitely join the Discord, especially, beginning of the cycle is always fun, seeing people sharing what they're finding is working or not working, or sharing videos on, when the new game comes out, helping people out. So it's always, a lot of good info in there, especially for start of the cycle when no one really knows what's going on.
Definitely, yeah, no, very good point. And thank you very much as well to Neil, who certainly will have a lot going on at the start of the cycle.
Yes, thank you very much for having me on. I really enjoy these podcasts. It's good, of course, speaking to you as well.
Yeah, always good. Remember, you can catch Neil, NealGuides, on YouTube for plenty of FIFA 23 guides when that comes around. And if you're listening to this podcast, perhaps a little bit closer to launch, catching up, then do subscribe so you can get those weekly podcasts into your podcast feed with a more consistent schedule and weekly release than is currently the case. Thank you very much to all the listeners out there for bearing with. And of course, a big thank you to all those supporters, particularly at this time of year when, if it wasn't for them, realistically, it'd be very difficult to be doing the podcast. So thank you very much. Really appreciate it. And a big thank you to those icon supporters. Dave B, Coach Vass, Chris W, DJ FIFA Player, 𝘭𝘁𝘬𝘦, Steve C, Matt L, Alistair, Alan G, Anthony R, Dominic, Rob P, L, Jeff B, Christopher R, Stephen F, Michael, Tom B, Damon H, Nick Jack M, Eric T, Roger D, Alex M, Dan W, Siler P, Matt H, Harry P, Neil P, Adam G, @𝘵𝘂𝗱𝗏𝗀𝗀, Brian S, Andrew C, Sam K, Jake G, Michael P, Zach O, Springford, Patrick, Dominic G, Adam HC, Adam R, Andy H, Joe W, Dylan, Orion B, Mindor L, and Tim J. Plus a special thanks to Luke M, Dave B, 𝘭𝘁𝘬, Tom M, Darren W, and Pato Foot for advice and production assistance. Before I leave you, just one more thing to add though. FIFA's a bit like life really, it has its many ups and its many downs. If you're having a few more downs than ups in real life in these more difficult times, then please don't feel that you're alone or need to struggle on without taking action. If you go to thecalmzone.net, there's loads of resources, advice, support, or even just a friendly chat for anyone who needs it. If it sounds like it could help you, then head over to thecalmzone.net. And for now, have a good one, and I'll catch you on the next podcast.